In a cramped garage in Detroit, surrounded by salvaged electronics and half-finished projects, Marcus Chen had been building something impossible for 3 months. Not a million-dollar prototype for a tech giant, not a commissioned piece for wealthy clients, but a racing simulator for a 12-year-old boy who would never walk again. What Marcus didn't know was that his creation would catch the attention of Formula One's biggest names, sparking a bidding war that would change not just his life, but redefine what it means to chase dreams when the world says you can't. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind cut through Detroit like a blade, carrying with it the scent of rust and fading dreams. In the narrow alley between 2 abandoned warehouses, Marcus Chen pulled his jacket tighter as he walked toward the only building that still had lights on. The garage had been his sanctuary for the past 2 years, ever since the aerospace company had laid him off, along with 300 other engineers. What had once been a promising career designing flight simulators for commercial airlines had become a desperate hustle fixing neighborhood electronics for $20 a pop. Marcus pushed open the heavy metal door, and the familiar smell of soldering flux and motor oil greeted him like an old friend. The space was organized chaos, workbenches lined with circuit boards, computer monitors flickering with code, and in the center of it all, his masterpiece. The racing simulator didn't look like much to an untrained eye, cobbled together from salvaged car seats, surplus aircraft instruments, and a gaming wheel he'd bought secondhand. But beneath its humble exterior lay something extraordinary. A fusion of aeronautical engineering principles and gaming technology that could make anyone feel like they were racing at 200 miles per hour. The project had started as a distraction, something to keep his hands busy while he sent out resume after resume to companies that never called back. But 3 months ago, everything changed when he met Danny Rivera. Marcus had been at the local electronics store, trying to negotiate a payment plan for some capacitors he desperately needed, when he'd overheard a conversation between a woman and the store clerk. She was asking about gaming equipment, something that could work with specialized adaptive controllers. Her voice carried a weight that Marcus recognized, the exhaustion of someone fighting a battle they never expected to face. The woman was Danny Rivera, and she was shopping for her son Danny, who had been paralyzed from the chest down in a car accident 6 months earlier. Danny had been obsessed with Formula One racing before the accident, spending hours watching races and dreaming of becoming a driver. Now, confined to a wheelchair, those dreams seemed impossible. Elena was trying to find something, anything, that might bring back a spark of joy to her son's eyes. Marcus had introduced himself quietly, explaining that he was an engineer who specialized in simulators. He'd offered to take a look at what Danny needed, maybe suggest some modifications to existing equipment. But when he'd visited their small apartment and met Danny, a quiet kid with intelligent eyes and hands that never stopped moving despite his condition, Marcus knew that off-the-shelf solutions wouldn't be enough. Danny didn't just want to play racing games. He wanted to feel like he was really driving, to experience the physics and precision that real Formula One drivers lived for. He spoke about racing with a technical knowledge that impressed Marcus, understanding concepts like downforce and tire degradation that many adults couldn't grasp. In those conversations, Marcus saw something of himself, a mind that thought in systems and possibilities rather than limitations. That night, Marcus had gone back to his garage and started sketching. Not modifications to existing equipment, but something entirely new. A simulator that would translate every subtle input into realistic feedback, that would challenge Danny's mind and coordination in ways that might help him feel capable again. It was ambitious, maybe impossible given his limited resources, but Marcus had learned long ago that the best engineering solutions often came from having fewer options, not more. The first month had been about the hardware. Marcus had scoured junkyards for the perfect car seat, one that would provide the right driving position while accommodating Danny's wheelchair transfers. He'd found it in a crashed BMW, the leather worn, but the structure sound. The steering system came from a combination of aircraft yoke mechanisms and high-end gaming wheels, creating something that responded with the precision of real racing equipment. But the real breakthrough had come in the software. Marcus's background in flight simulation had taught him how to model complex physics in real time, and he'd applied those same principles to create a driving experience that was unlike anything available commercially. The simulator didn't just display pretty graphics, it calculated tire wear, fuel consumption, aerodynamic changes, and weather effects with the same accuracy used in professional racing simulators that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Working 16-hour days, Marcus had slowly brought his vision to life. He'd coded the physics engine from scratch, calibrated force feedback systems, and integrated multiple monitors to create an immersive field of view. Every component had been carefully selected and modified to meet Danny's specific needs, from hand controls that could handle complex racing maneuvers to feedback systems that would provide information through sound and vibration when traditional visual cues weren't enough. The project had consumed not just his time, but his savings. Marcus had sold his car, taken on extra repair work, and maxed out his credit cards to buy the components he couldn't salvage or build himself. His girlfriend Sarah had initially been supportive, but as the months wore on and Marcus became increasingly obsessed with the project, their relationship had strained to the breaking point. "You're throwing your life away for a kid you barely know," she'd said during their last fight. "This isn't going to lead anywhere, Marcus. You need to focus on finding a real job, not playing around in this garage." But Marcus couldn't explain what she didn't understand. This wasn't just about building a simulator. It was about proving that engineering could be more than just corporate profit margins and quarterly reports. It was about using his skills to solve a problem that mattered, to create something that would make a real difference in someone's life. In many ways, working on Danny's simulator had given Marcus a purpose he'd never found in his corporate career. The work had been solitary, just Marcus and his tools, and the endless iterations of code and calibration. But it had also been deeply satisfying in a way that designing aircraft simulators for airlines had never been. Every improvement he made wasn't measured in efficiency metrics or cost savings. It was measured in Danny's excitement when Marcus showed him progress videos, or in Elena's grateful smile when she saw how the project was evolving. Danny had become Marcus's unofficial consultant, offering feedback on everything from the steering sensitivity to the user interface design. Despite his youth, Danny had an intuitive understanding of what would make the simulator feel authentic. He'd suggested modifications that Marcus hadn't considered, like using different haptic feedback patterns to communicate tire grip levels, or implementing eye-tracking technology to allow for more natural head movement in the virtual cockpit. The relationship between Marcus and the Rivera family had grown beyond just engineer and client. Elena had started bringing Marcus dinner when she picked up Danny for his weekly testing sessions, insisting that he needed to eat something besides vending machine sandwiches. Danny had begun sharing racing strategies and technical insights that impressed Marcus with their sophistication. The kid didn't just love racing, he understood it at a level that went beyond casual fandom. As winter approached, the simulator was nearing completion. The hardware integration was finished, the software was stable, and the initial testing had exceeded Marcus's expectations, but he hadn't anticipated what would happen when word of his project began to spread beyond the Rivera family. It started with a video that Elena had posted on social media, showing Danny using an early version of the simulator. She'd wanted to share her gratitude for what Marcus was building, to document her son's joy as he experienced something that seemed impossible just months earlier. The video was simple, just Danny concentrating intensely as he navigated a virtual Monaco circuit, his hands moving with precision despite his paralysis, his face lit up with genuine happiness. Elena had maybe 50 followers, mostly family and friends. She'd expected a few likes and supportive comments. What she hadn't expected was for the video to be shared by a local news anchor who happened to be her cousin, then picked up by a regional motorsports blogger, then shared again by someone with connections to the professional racing world. Within a week, the video had been viewed thousands of times. Comments poured in from racing fans, engineers, and disability advocates who were amazed by what they saw. But it was a comment from a username that simply read, "Lewis 44 inches that changed everything." The message was brief. "This is incredible work. Would love to learn more about the engineering behind this. Please have the creator contact my team." Elena had dismissed it as a fake account, someone pretending to be the famous Formula One driver Lewis Hamilton. But when she'd shown the comment to Marcus, something had made him investigate further. The account was verified. The messages were consistent with Hamilton's known interests in technology and accessibility, and most importantly, there was a private message with contact information for Hamilton's management team. Marcus had stared at the screen for a long time before deciding to send an email. He'd explained the project, attached some technical specifications, and included the video of Danny using the simulator. He'd expected nothing to come of it, but he'd sent it anyway, partly out of curiosity, and partly because the past few months had taught him that impossible things sometimes happened when you weren't looking for them. The response had come within hours, not from a management team, but directly from Lewis Hamilton himself. He'd written about being impressed by the engineering innovation, by the potential for technology to break down barriers in motorsports, and by Danny's obvious talent behind the wheel. He'd asked if he could arrange to see the simulator in person, to understand how it worked and what it might mean for other young people facing similar challenges. That had been 2 days ago. Marcus was still processing the reality that one of the world's most famous racing drivers wanted to visit his cramped Detroit garage to see a simulator built for a paralyzed kid with salvaged parts and determination. But as he looked at his creation now, lit by the overhead fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh shadows and bright highlights, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just hope that the project would be successful, but hope that maybe his life was heading in a direction he couldn't have imagined. The aerospace industry had taught him to think in terms of specifications and requirements, but working on Danny's simulator had reminded him why he'd become an engineer in the first place. It wasn't about following predetermined paths or meeting corporate expectations. It was about solving problems that nobody else could solve, about building things that made the impossible possible. Marcus walked over to the simulator and ran his hand along the steering wheel, feeling the smooth leather that Danny's hands had gripped during countless. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Practice sessions. Tomorrow, Elena would bring Danny for another testing session, and Marcus would show them the latest improvements he'd made to the force feedback system. But tomorrow would also bring something else. A meeting that could change everything, not just for Marcus and his garage full of dreams, but for Danny and every other kid who'd been told that some dreams were simply out of reach. The simulator hummed quietly in the background, its computers running diagnostics and calibrations even when no one was driving. It was ready for whatever came next, a machine built with love and precision in equal measure, waiting to prove that sometimes the most powerful technology comes not from corporate boardrooms or well-funded labs, but from a garage where an engineer refused to accept that impossible was anything more than a word. Outside, Detroit slept under a blanket of clouds that promised snow, but inside the garage, the future was taking shape one circuit board at a time. Marcus didn't know yet that his creation would soon be the center of a bidding war between Formula One teams, or that Danny would become the youngest person ever to provide input on professional racing simulator development. He only knew that he'd built something special, something that mattered, and that tomorrow would bring the chance to share it with someone who might understand just how extraordinary the ordinary could become when guided by purpose instead of profit. The city around them was full of abandoned factories and broken dreams, but in this small space filled with salvaged electronics and stubborn hope, the future was being built one component at a time. And for the first time in months, Marcus Chen fell asleep not worrying about what tomorrow might bring, but excited to find out. When morning came, it would bring visitors who would see potential where others saw limitations, who would recognize innovation disguised as necessity, and who would understand that sometimes the most revolutionary technology comes from the most unlikely places. But for now, there was only the quiet hum of electronics, the distant sound of traffic, and the peaceful sleep of someone who had built something beautiful and was about to discover just how much the world needed what he had created. Danny Rivera had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because he couldn't sleep, but because today felt different from every other day since the accident. For 6 months, mornings had been about physical therapy appointments, doctor visits, and the slow, difficult process of learning to navigate a world that hadn't been designed for someone in a wheelchair. But today was about racing, about the simulator that Marcus had been building, and about the possibility that his dreams hadn't died in the twisted metal of his family's car on that rainy evening in April. The accident had happened on a Thursday. Danny could remember every detail with crystal clarity. The way the rain had been coming down in sheets, making the windshield wipers work overtime, his mother humming along to a song on the radio, the green light that had meant they could safely proceed through the intersection. He remembered the impact, sudden and violent, spinning their car like a toy, and filling the world with the sound of breaking glass and screaming metal. What he couldn't remember was anything between that moment and waking up in the hospital 3 days later, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped and hummed with electronic urgency. The doctors had explained everything in careful, measured tones, spinal cord injury, paralysis, rehabilitation, adaptation. They'd used words like adjustment and new normal, as if those phrases could somehow make the reality easier to accept. The first month had been the hardest. Not just physically, though learning to transfer from bed to wheelchair, to navigate doorways and curbs, to manage the basic functions of daily life had been exhausting and often humiliating. But worse had been the mental adjustment, the gradual understanding that everything he'd planned for his future had changed in an instant. Before the accident, Danny had been working toward his goal of becoming a Formula One driver, with the single-minded determination that only a 12-year-old could possess. He'd saved every penny of his allowance to buy racing magazines and video games. He'd memorized the statistics of every current driver and could recite the technical specifications of every car on the grid. His bedroom walls were covered with posters of famous circuits, and he'd spent hours studying racing lines and braking points with the intensity of someone much older. His parents had been supportive but realistic about his dreams. They'd signed him up for a local go-kart racing program, where Danny had quickly proven that his passion was matched by genuine talent. He'd won his first race just 2 months after starting, and by the end of his first season he was regularly competing against kids who'd been racing for years. His reflexes were sharp, his understanding of racing dynamics was intuitive, and most importantly, he had the kind of calm focus under pressure that separated good drivers from great ones. The accident had stolen all of that. Not just the immediate possibility of racing, but the entire trajectory of his life. Formula One didn't have wheelchair divisions, and even if it did, the physical demands of driving at those speeds would be impossible for someone with his level of paralysis. For weeks after leaving the hospital, Danny had refused to watch racing on television, couldn't bear to see what he would never be able to do. But gradually his love for the sport had overcome his grief. He'd started watching races again, first reluctantly, then with renewed passion. He began to focus on the technical aspects that had always fascinated him: aerodynamics, tire strategy, the split-second decisions that separated winners from also-rans. If he couldn't drive, he could still understand racing at a level that most people never reached. That's when Marcus had entered their lives. Danny's mother had been trying to find some way to reconnect her son with his passion, some way to make racing feel accessible again. She'd heard about adaptive gaming controllers and thought maybe racing video games could provide some small comfort. But when she'd met Marcus at the electronics store and heard about his background in simulation technology, something had clicked. The first time Marcus had visited their apartment, Danny had been skeptical. He'd met well-meaning adults before, people who wanted to help but didn't really understand what he needed. But Marcus had been different. Instead of talking about inspiration and overcoming challenges, he'd ask technical questions about racing, about what aspects of driving were most important to Danny, about how he thought technology might bridge the gap between what he wanted to do and what seemed possible. Over the following weeks, Marcus had continued to visit, not as a charity case or a good deed, but as a collaboration between two people who understood that engineering was about solving problems that seemed impossible. Danny had found himself explaining the nuances of racing in ways he'd never had to before, helping Marcus understand not just what racing looked like, but what it felt like to be perfectly connected to a machine traveling at impossible speeds. As the simulator had taken shape, Danny had become increasingly excited about what Marcus was creating. This wasn't just a gaming setup. It was something that could genuinely replicate the experience of racing. The force feedback through the steering wheel communicated tire grip and road surface in ways that made Danny feel connected to the virtual car. The multiple monitors created a field of view that made him forget he was sitting in a Detroit garage, rather than a Formula One cockpit. But more than the technology itself, Danny appreciated that Marcus treated him as a serious consultant rather than just the beneficiary of charity. When Danny suggested modifications or improvements, Marcus listened and implemented them if they made sense. When Danny explained why certain aspects of the simulation felt wrong, Marcus went back to his code and adjusted the physics until they felt right. It was the first time since the accident that Danny felt like his knowledge and opinions actually mattered to someone. The night before, Elena had told Danny about the message from Lewis Hamilton, about the possibility that a real Formula One driver might want to see the simulator. Danny had tried to contain his excitement, but the prospect of meeting one of his heroes, of showing him something that Marcus had built specifically for Danny's needs, was almost overwhelming. Lewis Hamilton had been Danny's favorite driver since he'd started following Formula One. Not just because of his success on the track, though his multiple world championships were certainly impressive, but because of his advocacy for diversity and accessibility in motorsports. Hamilton had spoken frequently about breaking down barriers and creating opportunities for people who hadn't traditionally been represented in racing. If anyone would understand what Marcus had accomplished with the simulator, it would be him. Now, as Danny went through his morning routine, transferring from bed to wheelchair and getting dressed for what might be the most important day of his young life, he found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Marcus the previous week. They'd been testing a new feature that provided audible feedback about car performance, and Marcus had asked Danny what he thought about possibly sharing the simulator with other kids facing similar challenges. "I built this for you," Marcus had said, "but I'm starting to think it could be something bigger. Not just a one-off project, but maybe a way to show people that racing doesn't have to be limited by physical differences." Danny had been quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. The simulator had become his private connection to the racing world, his secret weapon for staying connected to his dreams. But the idea that it might help other kids, that Marcus's engineering could break down barriers for people beyond just Danny himself, was exciting in a different way. "Would you be okay with that?" Marcus had continued. If this became something that other people knew about, that maybe got attention from the racing world, Danny's answer had been immediate and certain. If it helps other kids feel like they can still race, then yes, absolutely yes. Now, as Elena helped him transfer into the car for the trip to Marcus's garage, Danny felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that reminded him of the feeling he'd had before his first go-kart race. It was the sense that something important was about to happen, that the trajectory of his life might be about to change in ways he couldn't predict. The drive to the garage took them through neighborhoods that showed both the decline and the resilience of Detroit. Abandoned lots sat next to community gardens. Empty factories stood across from small businesses that had somehow survived decades of economic hardship. It was a city that understood about dreams deferred and the stubborn determination required to keep building something better from whatever materials were available. When they pulled up to Marcus's garage, Danny could see that the engineer was already there, probably had been for hours. Lights spilled out from under the metal door, and Danny could hear the familiar hum of the simulator's computers running their startup sequences. His heart rate increased as Elena helped him transfer to his wheelchair, and they approached the entrance. Marcus opened the door before they could knock, his face showing a mixture of excitement and anxiety that Danny recognized because he felt exactly the same way. "Ready for this?" Marcus asked, and Danny nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what this was going to turn out to be. Inside the garage, the simulator looked exactly as Danny remembered it, but somehow more significant in the context of what was about to happen. This machine, built from salvaged parts and powered by determination, was about to be evaluated by one of the greatest racing drivers in the world. The stakes felt enormous, not just for Marcus's work, but for everything the simulator represented about possibility and adaptation and the refusal to accept limitations. "He should be here any minute," Marcus said, checking his phone for what was probably the 20th time that morning. His team said he'd arrive around 10. Danny positioned his wheelchair next to the simulator and looked at the steering wheel, the monitors, the carefully calibrated systems that had become as familiar to him as his own hands. In a few minutes, Lewis Hamilton would see what Marcus had built, would understand what it meant for someone like Danny to have access to this level of simulation technology. The outcome of that meeting would determine not just the future of this project, but possibly the future of accessibility in motorsports. Outside, the sound of car engines suggested that their visitors were arriving. Danny took a deep breath and prepared to show the world what was possible when engineering met determination, when dreams refused to be limited by circumstances, and when someone cared enough to build a bridge between what was and what could be. The garage door was still closed, but Danny could hear voices outside, the sound of car doors closing, footsteps approaching. Marcus wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at Danny with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. "Whatever happens," Marcus said quietly, "you should know that building this for you has been the best work of my life." Danny nodded, understanding exactly what Marcus meant. Win or lose, succeed or fail. They had created something together that proved dreams could survive even the most difficult circumstances. Now it was time to find out if the rest of the world was ready to see what they had seen all along. The knock on the garage door came at exactly 10 o'clock. the kind of punctuality that spoke to professional discipline and respect for other people's time. Marcus Chen wiped his palms on his jeans one last time and walked toward the entrance, his heart beat loud enough that he was certain Danny could hear it from across the garage. 3 months of work, months of late nights, and depleted savings and stubborn hope were about to be judged by someone who understood racing at the highest level. Marcus pulled up the heavy door, and the first thing he noticed was how normal everything seemed. No entourage of security guards or media crews, no flashy cars or obvious displays of wealth. Just 2 men standing in the Detroit morning light. One tall and athletic with kind eyes and a genuine smile, the other shorter and more serious, carrying a tablet and wearing the kind of focused expression that suggested he was always thinking 3 steps ahead. "Marcus?" The taller man extended his hand with easy confidence. "Lewis Hamilton. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Marcus shook hands with one of the most famous athletes in the world and felt somehow surprised by how normal the interaction felt. Hamilton's grip was firm but not aggressive, his manner friendly but professional. This wasn't someone putting on a show or trying to impress anyone. This was someone genuinely interested in what he'd come to see. "This is Tom Bradley," Hamilton continued, gesturing to his companion. "He's one of the senior engineers with the Mercedes Formula One team. When I showed him the video of your simulator, he insisted on coming along." Bradley stepped forward and shook Marcus's hand with the focused attention of someone evaluating technical work. "I've been designing racing simulators for 15 years, he said. "And I have to admit, what I saw in that video intrigued me. The motion dynamics looked far more sophisticated than anything I'd expect to see outside of a professional facility." Marcus felt a surge of professional pride, mixed with nervous energy. Having his work evaluated by a Mercedes F1 engineer was both exciting and terrifying. "Would you like to come in and see how it works?" As they entered the garage, Marcus watched their faces for reactions. He knew the space looked rough around the edges, all exposed concrete and fluorescent lighting and the accumulated chaos of months of intensive work. But he also knew that both of these men had spent enough time around racing technology to recognize innovation when they saw it, regardless of its packaging. Danny was positioned next to the simulator, and Marcus could see that the kid was trying to contain his excitement at meeting his racing hero. Hamilton noticed Danny immediately and approached with the same genuine friendliness he'd shown Marcus. "You must be Danny," Hamilton said, crouching down to meet Danny at eye level. "I saw you driving in the video, and I have to say, your racing lines through Monaco were absolutely perfect. Where did you learn to handle those corners like that?" Danny's face lit up with the kind of joy that Marcus hadn't seen since before the accident. "I've been studying racing videos for years," Danny said, his initial shyness giving way to enthusiasm. "Monaco is all about momentum conservation and late braking. Most people try to take the corners too fast and lose time on the exits." Hamilton nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. You've got good racing instincts." He looked around at the simulator setup, taking in the multiple monitors, the force feedback steering system, the carefully positioned controls. "Would you mind showing me how this thing works?" Danny transferred smoothly from his wheelchair to the simulator's seat, a movement that had become second nature over the past months of testing. Marcus moved to the control station and began initializing the system, explaining the basic operation as the screens came to life with the familiar interface of his custom racing software. "The physics engine is built from scratch," Marcus explained as Danny selected a circuit and car combination. "It calculates real-time aerodynamics, tire degradation, fuel consumption, even weather effects. Everything is modeled to professional standards, but the interface is designed specifically for Danny's needs." Bradley had pulled out his tablet and was taking notes as Danny began a practice lap around Silverstone. The engineer's expression grew increasingly interested as he watched the simulator's response to Danny's inputs, the way the force feedback communicated information about track conditions and car behavior. "The latency is incredibly low," Bradley murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "And the steering response is much more sophisticated than anything I've seen in consumer-grade equipment." He looked up at Marcus. "Did you design the force feedback system yourself?" Marcus nodded. "I adapted aircraft yoke mechanisms and combined them with high-torque servo motors. The feedback algorithms are based on actual racing data that I obtained through various sources." He didn't mention that those sources had involved purchasing expensive racing simulator data from a bankrupt gaming company that had been liquidating its assets. Hamilton was watching Danny drive with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what they were seeing. Danny's hands moved with precision and confidence, managing complex corner sequences with the kind of smooth efficiency that marked genuinely talented drivers. The paralysis that had ended his physical racing career was completely irrelevant in this virtual environment. "Try the wet weather setting," quote, Hamilton suggested. "Let's see how the car handles when the track starts to get slippery." Danny nodded and adjusted the simulation parameters. As the virtual rain began to fall, the car's behavior changed dramatically, requiring completely different techniques for managing speed and cornering forces. Danny adapted smoothly, demonstrating the kind of car control that would have been impressive in any context, let alone for someone who had never driven a real racing car. Bradley was furiously taking notes, occasionally asking Marcus technical questions about sensor calibration and data processing speeds. It was clear that the engineer was seeing something in the simulator that exceeded his expectations, something that might have applications beyond just accessibility gaming. "The haptic feedback through the steering wheel," Bradley said. "How are you generating such precise tire grip information?" Marcus launched into a detailed explanation of his sensor fusion algorithms, describing how he combined multiple data streams to create realistic force feedback. It was technical conversation at a level that few people could follow, but Bradley not only kept up, but asked increasingly sophisticated follow-up questions. Meanwhile, Hamilton was working with Danny to explore different aspects of the simulation. They tested various cars and tracks, experimented with different weather conditions, and discussed racing strategies with the kind of technical depth that made it clear Hamilton saw Danny as a serious racing talent rather than just an inspirational story. "Your understanding of racing dynamics is exceptional," Hamilton told Danny as they concluded a particularly challenging wet weather session at Spa-Francorchamps. "Have you ever considered that there might be opportunities in professional racing that don't require being physically behind the wheel?" Danny looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Hamilton glanced at Bradley, who nodded slightly. "Well, F1 teams use simulators extensively for car development and driver training. The best simulator drivers are often just as skilled as the race drivers themselves. They need to understand car behavior, setup changes, tire dynamics, all the things you clearly understand at a very high level." Bradley looked up from his tablet. "Actually, that's something we've been discussing at Mercedes. The skill set required for professional simulator work is really about racing intelligence and adaptability, not physical strength or mobility. Someone with Danny's understanding of racing dynamics and his obvious talent behind the wheel could potentially be quite valuable to a racing team." Marcus felt something shift in the air of the garage, a sense that this conversation was heading somewhere he hadn't anticipated. He'd built the simulator to give Danny a way to stay connected to racing, but it sounded like Hamilton and Bradley were suggesting something much more significant. "Would you mind if I tried the simulator myself?" Hamilton asked Marcus. "I'd like to get a feel for how it compares to the professional systems we use." Danny transferred back to his wheelchair and Hamilton settled into the driver's seat. Marcus reset the system and selected a current-generation Formula One car at the Monaco circuit, figuring that if anyone could evaluate the realism of his simulation, it would be someone who had actually won the Monaco Grand Prix multiple times. As Hamilton began to drive, Marcus watched his body language carefully. Professional racing drivers developed incredibly refined senses for how cars should feel, how steering inputs should translate into vehicle response, how braking and acceleration should affect weight distribution. If the simulation felt wrong to Hamilton, Marcus would know immediately. But Hamilton's expression as he completed his first lap was one of impressed surprise. "This is remarkably accurate," he said, continuing to drive while talking. "The weight transfer characteristics are spot on, and the tire model is better than some professional simulators I've used." Bradley was watching the telemetry data on Marcus's monitoring screens, comparing Hamilton's driving inputs to the simulator's responses. "The data correlation is excellent," he said. "This is professional-grade simulation technology." Hamilton completed several more laps, testing different aspects of the car's behavior and experimenting with various setup changes that Marcus had programmed into the system. His feedback was detailed and technical, the kind of evaluation that Marcus had never expected to receive, but that validated months of careful engineering work. "I have to ask," Hamilton said as he climbed out of the simulator, What's your background in racing simulation? This is far more sophisticated than anything I'd expect to see from an independent developer. Marcus explained his aerospace engineering background, his experience with flight simulation systems, and how he'd adapted those principles to create a racing simulation that could meet Danny's specific needs. He described the months of research, the careful calibration of every system, the hundreds of hours spent refining algorithms and testing responses. "And you built all of this for Danny?" Hamilton asked. "Not as a commercial project or a research grant, just because you wanted to help a kid stay connected to racing?" Marcus nodded, feeling slightly embarrassed by the attention. Danny's passion for racing reminded me why I became an engineer in the first place. It wasn't about corporate profits or meeting specifications. It was about solving problems that mattered to people. Hamilton and Bradley exchanged glances, and Marcus sensed some kind of unspoken communication between them. Bradley made a few more notes on his tablet, then looked directly at Marcus. "Would you be interested in discussing this project with some other people in the Formula One community?" Bradley asked. "I think there might be opportunities here that go beyond just Danny's simulator." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. "What kind of opportunities?" Hamilton smiled. "Well, that's something we'd need to explore, but I think you should know that what you've built here isn't just impressive technology, it's potentially revolutionary. And in Formula One, revolution is always interesting." Outside the garage, Marcus could hear the city of Detroit going about its business, unaware that in this small space, something was happening that might change the trajectory of several lives. He looked at Danny, whose face showed excitement mixed with bewilderment, and realized that their quiet project had somehow attracted the attention of people who could turn it into something much larger. The conversation continued for another hour, covering technical details, potential applications, and possibilities that Marcus hadn't allowed himself to imagine. When Hamilton and Bradley finally prepared to leave, they did so with promises to be in touch soon, with suggestions that Marcus might want to document his work more formally, and with the clear implication that this meeting was the beginning of something rather than the end. As their car pulled away from the garage, Marcus and Danny sat in silence for several minutes, processing what had just happened. The simulator hummed quietly in the background, its screens displaying the Monaco circuit, where Hamilton had just set lap times that would have been competitive in an actual Formula One race. "Did that really just happen?" Danny asked finally. Marcus nodded slowly, still trying to fully grasp the implications of the morning's events. "I think it did. And I think it's about to get very interesting around here." Neither of them could have predicted what would happen over the following weeks. As word of their garage simulator spread through the Formula One community and began to attract attention from people who saw potential where others had seen only limitations. But in that moment, sitting in the Detroit garage where impossible things had become routine, they both understood that their lives had just changed in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The future, which had seemed so constrained just hours earlier, had suddenly become full of possibilities that neither of them had dared to imagine. And it had all started with an engineer who refused to accept that dreams had to be limited by circumstances, and a kid who refused to let an accident define what he could become. The call came 3 days later, just as Marcus was calibrating the suspension dynamics for a new track Danny wanted to master. The phone rang with an international number that Marcus almost didn't answer, assuming it was another robocall or marketing scheme. But something made him pause his work and pick up, and the voice on the other end changed everything he thought he knew about where his life was heading. "Marcus, this is Angela Reeves from Red Bull Racing. Lewis Hamilton gave me your contact information and suggested I reach out about a project you've been working on." Her accent was crisp, professional, British. "Would you have time to discuss some potential collaboration opportunities?" Marcus set down his soldering iron carefully, his hand trembling slightly. Red Bull Racing wasn't just any Formula One team. They were one of the most innovative organizations in motorsports, known for pushing technological boundaries and thinking outside conventional frameworks. The idea that they were calling him in his Detroit garage about Danny's simulator seemed surreal. "I'd be happy to discuss it," Marcus managed, trying to keep his voice steady. "What kind of collaboration were you thinking about?" Angela's explanation was both exciting and overwhelming. Red Bull had been developing their own advanced simulator technologies, but they'd been struggling with accessibility interfaces that could accommodate drivers with different physical capabilities. Hamilton had shared video footage of Danny using Marcus's simulator, and their engineering team had been impressed by the sophisticated haptic feedback systems and the intuitive interface design. "We're particularly interested in your force feedback algorithms," Angela continued. "Our engineers believe your approach to translating vehicle dynamics into tactile information could have applications beyond accessibility. We'd like to explore licensing your technology and potentially bringing you in as a consultant on our next-generation simulator development." The conversation continued for 45 minutes, covering technical specifications, intellectual property considerations, and timeline expectations. When Marcus finally hung up, he sat in stunned silence for several minutes, staring at his phone as if it might explain what had just happened to his life. Red Bull wasn't the only team that called that week. Mercedes contacted him the day after Angela's call, followed by McLaren, then Ferrari. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: expressions of interest in his technology, requests for technical documentation, and hints at collaboration opportunities that could transform his garage project into something with genuine commercial value. But it was the call from Matteo Rossi at Ferrari that truly made Marcus understand the magnitude of what was happening. Rossi was the team's head of simulation technology, an engineer whose work on virtual reality racing environments had revolutionized how Formula One teams prepared for races. "Your force feedback integration is unlike anything we've seen," Rossi told Marcus during their hour-long conversation. "The way you've managed to communicate tire degradation and track surface changes through steering wheel vibrations is genuinely innovative. We've been working on similar problems for years without achieving this level of fidelity." More importantly, from Marcus's perspective, was Rossi's understanding of what the technology meant for accessibility in motorsports. Ferrari had been exploring ways to expand their simulator programs to include drivers who couldn't participate in traditional racing, and Marcus's work represented exactly the kind of breakthrough they'd been seeking. "We'd like to fly you to Maranello," Rossi said, referring to Ferrari's headquarters in Italy. "Our engineers would like to see your system in person, and we'd like to discuss how we might work together to develop this technology further." The idea of visiting Ferrari's legendary facility, of having his work evaluated by some of the most sophisticated engineers in motorsports, was both thrilling and terrifying. Marcus had spent his career designing aircraft simulators for commercial applications. The prospect of working with Formula One teams felt like stepping into an entirely different universe of engineering excellence. But as the offers and opportunities multiplied, Marcus found himself thinking more and more about Danny, and what all of this attention might mean for the kid who had inspired the project in the first place. The simulator had been built specifically for Danny's needs, designed to give him a way to stay connected to his racing dreams despite his physical limitations. Now was attracting interest from organizations that could potentially transform it into something much larger and more commercially significant. Danny's reaction to the sudden attention was characteristically thoughtful. When Marcus explained the various offers that were coming in, the 12-year-old listened carefully before asking the question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Will other kids like me be able to use this technology if you work with the F1 teams?" Danny asked. "Or will it just become something for professional racing?" It was exactly the question Marcus had been wrestling with as he tried to process the opportunities that were suddenly available to him. The commercial value of his technology was becoming clear, but he didn't want to lose sight of the original purpose: creating opportunities for young people who had been told their racing dreams were impossible. Danny Rivera had been watching the developments with a mixture of pride and concern. She was thrilled that Marcus's work was getting the recognition it deserved, and excited about what the attention might mean for Danny's future involvement in racing. But she was also protective of her son and worried about what would happen if the project became more about business than about helping kids connect with motorsports. "Danny's not just a test subject," she told Marcus during one of their conversations about the various offers. "He's been your partner in developing this technology. Whatever decisions you make, I hope you'll remember that this started because you cared about helping one kid pursue his passion." Marcus appreciated Elena's directness, and her reminder helped him focus on what really mattered, as he tried to navigate the suddenly complex landscape of opportunities and obligations. He'd started this project to help Danny, but it was becoming clear that the technology he'd developed could have much broader applications for accessibility in motorsports. The breakthrough came during a video conference, with representatives from all 4 Formula One teams that had expressed interest in his technology. Instead of trying to choose between competing offers, Marcus proposed something different: a collaborative development program that would advance racing simulation technology while maintaining a focus on accessibility applications. "I'd like to suggest that we approach this as a consortium," Marcus said during the call, which included engineers and executives from Red Bull, Mercedes, McLaren, and Ferrari. "Each team brings different expertise and perspectives, and I think we could accomplish more working together than trying to develop competing systems." The proposal was ambitious and unconventional. Formula One teams were notorious for guarding their technological advantages jealously, rarely sharing innovations that might benefit their competitors. But Marcus's accessibility focus provided a framework for collaboration that transcended normal competitive considerations. Tom Bradley from Mercedes was the first to express support for the consortium approach. "This technology has applications that go beyond competitive advantage," he said. "If we're serious about expanding access to motorsports, then collaboration makes sense." Angela Reeves from Red Bull agreed, pointing out that accessibility technologies often benefited from shared development resources and standardized interfaces. "We're not just talking about racing applications here," she said. "This could be about creating pathways for young people who never thought motorsports was available to them." The consortium structure also appealed to Marcus because it meant his technology would be developed by multiple teams with different technical approaches and priorities. Rather than being limited to one organization's vision, the accessibility applications could benefit from the combined expertise of 4 world-class engineering organizations. But the most important validation came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the consortium discussions began, Marcus received a call from the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, the governing body for international motorsports. They'd been following the development of his accessibility technology and were interested in exploring how it might be integrated into official FIA programs. Dr. Sarah Chen, the FIA's Director of Technical Innovation, explained that the organization had been looking for ways to expand participation in motorsports among people with disabilities. Marcus's simulator technology represented exactly the kind of breakthrough that could make high-level racing accessible to a much broader range of participants. "We're not just talking about recreational racing here," Dr. Chen told Marcus during their initial conversation. "We're considering the possibility of establishing official FIA championships for simulation racing, with full recognition as legitimate motorsports competition." The implications were staggering. If the FIA established official sim racing championships with accessibility provisions, it would mean that drivers like Danny could compete for real racing titles, recognized by the same organization that governed Formula One, World Rally Championship, and other premier motorsports series. Marcus shared this development with Danny during one of their regular testing sessions, and the kid's reaction was immediate and emotional. For months, Danny had been using the simulator as a way to stay connected to racing, but the idea that it might lead to actual competitive opportunities was almost overwhelming. "You mean I could actually race for real championships?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Like, official racing that counts?" Marcus nodded, still processing the magnitude of what Dr. Chen had described. "It's still in the early planning stages, but yes. If this moves forward, you could be competing against other drivers from around the world for official FIA titles." The consortium development program moved quickly once the FIA expressed formal interest. Engineers from all 4 Formula One teams began collaborating on refinements to Marcus's technology, contributing expertise in areas like virtual reality integration, biometric monitoring, and advanced physics modeling. Danny became an official consultant to the development program, working with engineers from some of the most prestigious racing organizations in the world to refine interfaces and feedback systems. His insights about what made simulation feel authentic were invaluable to engineers who understood the technical aspects of racing, but needed to understand how those dynamics translated into accessible interfaces. The work was intense and demanding, requiring Marcus to split his time between the Detroit garage where the original simulator continued to evolve and video conferences with engineers across multiple time zones. But it was also the most fulfilling work of his career, combining his technical expertise with a sense of purpose that went far beyond corporate profit margins. 6 months after Lewis Hamilton's first visit to the garage, Marcus found himself standing in the McLaren Technology Center in Surrey, England, looking at a prototype accessibility racing simulator that incorporated his force feedback algorithms with advanced motion platforms and virtual reality systems worth more than his house. The simulator was being tested by a group of young drivers from across Europe, all of whom had physical disabilities that prevented them from participating in traditional motorsports. Watching them compete against each other with the same intensity and skill that characterized any racing competition, Marcus felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the commercial success of his technology, and everything to do with seeing dreams made possible. Danny was part of that testing group, having been flown to England as part of the consortium's evaluation program. Marcus watched as the kid who had inspired this entire project demonstrated racing skills that impressed professional engineers and competed wheel-to-wheel with other young drivers who shared his passion for motorsports. "This is just the beginning," Tom Bradley told Marcus as they watched Danny execute a perfect overtaking maneuver through the chicane at Monza. "The FIA announcement is coming next month, and when it does, everything changes for kids like these." The announcement, when it came, exceeded even Marcus's optimistic expectations. The FIA officially established the Global Accessibility Racing Championship, a new series that would use advanced simulation technology to create competitive racing opportunities for drivers with disabilities. The championship would be sanctioned at the same level as other FIA series, with official titles, points, standings, and recognition as legitimate motorsports competition. More importantly, the championship would be supported by a development program designed to identify and nurture young racing talent regardless of physical limitations. Danny would be among the first drivers selected for the program, but he wouldn't be alone. Young people from around the world who had thought their racing dreams were impossible would now have a pathway to competitive motorsports. Marcus's technology formed the foundation of the championship's technical regulations, ensuring that all competitors would have access to the same sophisticated simulation systems that had been developed through the consortium program. But the real breakthrough wasn't technological, it was cultural. For the first time in motorsports history, physical disability wouldn't be a barrier to competing for official racing titles. The media attention was overwhelming. Marcus found himself featured in engineering magazines, interviewed by motorsports journalists, and invited to speak at conferences about accessibility technology. But the interview that mattered most to him was the one where he sat next to Danny on a local Detroit news program, explaining how a project that had started in a garage had become something that would change motorsports forever. "The important thing to remember," Marcus told the interviewer, "is that this technology didn't come from a corporate research lab or a university program. It came from a kid who refused to let an accident end his racing dreams, and from the recognition that engineering should be about solving problems that matter to people." Danny, now 13 and more confident than Marcus had ever seen him, added his own perspective to the interview. "A year ago, I thought racing was something I'd only be able to watch. Now I'm preparing to compete for an official FIA championship. That's not just about technology. It's about people who believed that dreams don't have to be limited by circumstances." The Global Accessibility Racing Championship would hold its inaugural season the following year, with Danny among the featured drivers. But Marcus knew that the real victory had already been achieved in a Detroit garage where an engineer had decided that impossible was just another engineering problem waiting to be solved. As he walked through that garage now, looking at the original simulator that had started everything, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since those first conversations with Danny about racing lines and tire degradation. The space was still cramped, still filled with salvaged electronics and stubborn hope, but it had become something more than just a workshop. It had become the birthplace of a revolution in motorsports accessibility. The future stretched ahead, full of championships to be won and barriers to be broken. But Marcus knew that the most important work had already been accomplished. A kid who had been told his racing dreams were over was preparing to compete for official motorsports titles, and other young people around the world would soon have the same opportunities. In the end, that's what engineering was really about. Not just building machines, but building possibilities for people who had been told that some dreams were simply out of reach. And in a small garage in Detroit, that principle had changed the world one circuit, board at a time. The transformation wasn't just about technology or opportunity. It was about recognition that talent and passion weren't limited by physical circumstances, and that sometimes the most important innovations came not from well-funded laboratories, but from people who cared enough to solve problems that others had accepted as unsolvable. Marcus Chen had started this project as a way to help one kid stay connected to racing. He'd ended up helping to redefine what was possible in motorsports for an entire generation of young people. And it had all begun with the simple recognition that dreams deserved better than acceptance of limitations, and that engineering could be a tool for expanding what seemed possible in the world. The garage hummed quietly with the sound of electronics and possibility, ready for whatever challenges and opportunities tomorrow might bring. Outside, Detroit continued its own story of resilience and reinvention. But inside this small space, the future had already arrived, built from determination and salvaged parts, and the unshakable belief that impossible was just another word for a problem that hadn't been solved yet. 2 years later, the roar of engines filled the Monaco Convention Center. But these weren't the sounds of combustion and exhaust. They were the digital symphonies of 32 racing simulators operating at the highest level of competitive motorsports, each one representing a dream that had once seemed impossible. Danny Rivera adjusted his racing gloves and settled into the cockpit of his simulator, the same basic design that Marcus had first built in that Detroit garage but now refined through millions of dollars of development and the expertise of 4 Formula One teams. The haptic feedback system that had started as salvaged aircraft parts now incorporated cutting-edge technology that could communicate the subtlest changes in tire grip and aerodynamic balance. Around him, drivers from 23 countries prepared for the final race of the inaugural Global Accessibility Racing Championship season. Each of them had their own story of barriers overcome and possibilities discovered, but they were united by something deeper than their individual circumstances. They were here because someone had decided that dreams deserved better than acceptance of limitations. Marcus stood in the pit area, watching the pre-race preparations with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who had spent 2 years turning an impossible idea into reality. The commercial success of his technology had been beyond his wildest projections, with licensing deals that had made him financially secure for life. But the real measure of success was sitting in those 32 simulators, drivers who were competing for official FIA championship points in a series that commanded the same respect as any other motorsports competition. The championship had attracted attention from sponsors, media outlets, and racing fans who had initially been skeptical about whether simulated racing could generate the same excitement as traditional motorsports. Those doubts had been thoroughly dispelled over the course of the season, as the drivers had demonstrated skill, strategy, and competitive fire that rivaled anything seen in conventional racing series. Danny had established himself as one of the championship's standout talents, winning 4 races during the season and entering this final round with a mathematical chance at the overall title. More importantly, from Marcus's perspective, Danny had grown into the kind of confident, articulate young man who could serve as an ambassador for what the championship represented. The race itself was a masterpiece of strategic thinking and precise execution. Danny started 5th, but worked his way forward through a combination of superior tire strategy and opportunistic overtaking that showcased exactly the kind of racing intelligence that had impressed Lewis Hamilton in that Detroit garage years earlier. With 10 laps remaining, Danny found himself in 2nd place, closing rapidly on the race leader. The battle for the lead unfolded over 5 intense laps, with Danny demonstrating the patience and tactical awareness that separated championship-caliber drivers from merely talented ones. When he finally executed the winning overtaking move through the chicane at turn 10, the convention center erupted with the kind of enthusiasm normally reserved for traditional racing victories. Danny Rivera, the kid who had been told his racing career was over before it began, had won the inaugural race of the Global Accessibility Racing Championship at Monaco, the same circuit where his heroes had achieved their greatest triumphs. But more than the victory itself, the moment represented proof that dreams could survive even the most devastating circumstances when supported by people who refused to accept limitations. Elena Rivera watched from the spectator area, tears streaming down her face as she saw her son achieve something that had seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. The accident that had changed their lives forever had led, through a series of connections and innovations that no one could have predicted, to this moment of triumph in one of motorsport's most prestigious venues. After the race, as Danny was interviewed by motorsports journalists who treated him with the same respect accorded to any championship-winning driver, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The technology that had started as a way to help one kid stay connected to racing had evolved into something that was reshaping how the world thought about accessibility in competitive sports. The Global Accessibility Racing Championship had exceeded all expectations for its inaugural season, attracting viewership numbers that rivaled established racing series and generating sponsor interest that ensured its long-term financial viability. But the real success was measured in the opportunities it had created for young people who had been excluded from motorsports through no fault of their own. Dr. Chen from the FIA approached Marcus during the post-race celebrations, her expression combining professional satisfaction with genuine emotion. "You know what you've accomplished here goes far beyond motorsports," she told him. "You've demonstrated that accessibility technology can create competitive opportunities that are every bit as legitimate and exciting as traditional sports." Other organizations are already exploring how to apply these principles to their own competitions. The ripple effects were already becoming apparent. Paralympic organizations had reached out about incorporating advanced simulation technology into their programs. Other motorsports series were exploring accessibility provisions that would expand participation opportunities. Universities were developing engineering programs focused on accessibility technology, inspired by Marcus's work and its impact on competitive sports. But for Marcus, the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Lewis Hamilton, whose initial visit to the Detroit garage had started the chain of events that led to this championship, presented Danny with the winner's trophy at the post-race ceremony. 3 years ago, Hamilton said to the assembled crowd, "I met a young man who refused to let circumstances define his possibilities. Today he's a championship-winning racing driver, competing at the highest level of his sport. That transformation didn't happen because we felt sorry for him or wanted to create an inspirational story. It happened because he had genuine talent, and someone cared enough to build the technology that would let that talent flourish." Hamilton turned to Marcus, who was standing nearby with the mixture of pride and humility that had characterized his approach to the project from the beginning. "Engineering isn't just about solving technical problems," Hamilton continued. "At its best, it's about expanding what seems possible in the world." Marcus Chen didn't just build a simulator. He built a bridge between dreams and reality for young people who had been told those dreams were impossible. The ceremony concluded with an announcement that surprised even Marcus. The consortium of Formula One teams that had supported the development of his accessibility technology was establishing a permanent research and development center in Detroit, housed in a renovated facility just miles from the garage, where everything had started. The center would focus on expanding accessibility technology across all forms of motorsports, with Marcus as its director and Danny as one of its primary consultants. Later that evening, as the celebration continued in Monte Carlo's harbor, with its backdrop of luxury yachts and glittering lights, Marcus found himself in conversation with young drivers from around the world who had competed in the championship. Each of them had their own story of obstacles overcome and dreams pursued despite difficult circumstances. But they were united by something that transcended their individual experiences. They were pioneers in a new form of motorsports that proved accessibility and excellence weren't mutually exclusive concepts. They had demonstrated that competitive racing could expand to include people who had been excluded from traditional motorsports, not as a charitable gesture but as recognition that talent and passion weren't limited by physical circumstances. As the evening wound down, Marcus walked along the Monaco harbor with Danny and Elena, reflecting on the improbable journey that had brought them from a cramped Detroit garage to the pinnacle of international motorsports. The city's lights reflected off the water, like scattered stars, and the warm Mediterranean air carried the sounds of celebration from the various parties that marked the conclusion of a successful racing weekend. "What happens next?" Danny asked, his championship trophy still in his hands, its weight a tangible reminder of what they had accomplished together. Marcus smiled, looking out at the harbor where some of the world's most expensive yachts were moored alongside racing team motorhomes and support vehicles. "Next, we make sure other kids get the same opportunities you've had. The technology exists now. The championship is established, and people understand that dreams don't have to be limited by circumstances. The hard part is over. Now we just have to keep building." Elena added her own perspective, speaking with the wisdom of someone who had watched her son navigate challenges that would have defeated many adults. "The most important thing is that we never forget this started because someone cared enough to help one kid pursue his passion. As long as we remember that, everything else will follow." The Global Accessibility Racing Championship had proven that barriers could be broken, that technology could create opportunities where none had existed before, and that sometimes the most important innovations came from people who simply refused to accept that limitations were permanent. In garages and workshops around the world, other engineers were already working on the next generation of accessibility technology, inspired by what Marcus had accomplished and determined to expand those possibilities even further. The future stretched ahead, full of championships to be won and dreams to be pursued. But the foundation had been laid in a Detroit garage where an engineer had decided that one kid's passion was worth whatever effort it took to keep it alive. That principle had changed motorsports forever, and it would continue to change lives for generations of young people who would never have to accept that their dreams were impossible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.